Microeconomics. It sounds academic, but you interact with it every single time you buy a coffee, fill up your gas tank, or rent an apartment. This is the study of how people and firms make decisions when resources are limited. In this lesson, we're going to build the supply and demand model from the ground up, and we'll use real world case studies to see it in action. By the end, you'll understand why prices do what they do, what happens when there's a shortage or a surplus, and how to predict the effects of market shifts. Here's the fundamental problem that microeconomics tries to solve. We have unlimited wants, but limited resources. That's scarcity. And because resources are scarce, every choice involves a trade-off. If you spend an hour studying economics, you can't spend that same hour working a part-time job. The value of what you give up, that lost wages in this case, is your opportunity cost. Now, microeconomists assume that people and firms are rational, meaning they weigh those trade-offs and try to maximize their benefit. A consumer wants the most satisfaction for their money. A firm wants the highest profit. And the tool we use to understand how they interact is the supply and demand model. Let's start with the demand side. The law of demand is straightforward. When the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. And when the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. That inverse relationship is one of the most reliable patterns in economics. Let's make this concrete with a case study. Think about Starbucks. In 2018, Starbucks raised prices on some of its drinks by about 10 to 30 cents. According to the law of demand, we'd expect customers to buy fewer of those drinks. And that's exactly what happened. Same-store sales growth slowed in the following quarter. But here's the interesting part. The drop wasn't huge because coffee has relatively few substitutes for regular drinkers. If you're hooked on your morning latte, you might grumble about the price increase, but you'll probably still buy it. That tells us something important about demand. It's not just about price. It's also about how easy it is to switch to something else. A demand schedule simply lists how many units consumers want at different prices. Plot those points on a graph, and you get a downward sloping demand curve. Higher price, lower quantity. Lower price, higher quantity. That curve is the visual representation of the law of demand. Individual demand is just the starting point. In a real market, you have thousands or millions of buyers, each with their own preferences and budget. The market demand curve is the sum of all those individual demand curves. Here's a case study to make it concrete. Consider the smartphone market. Apple and Samsung are two of the biggest players. Each company faces its own demand curve. At a given price, some number of people will buy an iPhone, and some number will buy a Galaxy phone. But the total market demand for smartphones is the combination of everyone's individual demand, including customers who buy from smaller brands like Google or OnePlus. To build the market demand curve, you take the quantity each person or group demands at each price and add them together horizontally. In the source material, we see Ivan and Olga as two individual consumers. Ivan might buy 3 units at $4, while Olga buys 2. At that same price, the market demand is 5 units. As you add more consumers, the curve gets wider and more representative of the whole market. This is why economists care about market demand. It's what actually determines prices in the real world. Now let's flip to the other side of the market, supply. The law of supply says that when the market price of a good rises, producers are willing to supply more of it. And when the price falls, they supply less. This is a direct positive relationship. Higher price, higher quantity supplied. Let's look at a classic real-world example, the global oil market. When the price of crude oil is high, oil companies invest in expensive drilling operations. tap into new reserves, and pump more. When prices crash, they shut down rigs and cut production. OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, famously coordinates production cuts among its members to keep prices from falling too low. In 2020, when demand for oil collapsed during the pandemic, OPEC and its allies slashed production by nearly 10 million barrels per day to prop up prices. That's the law of supply in action on a global scale. A supply schedule lists the quantities producers are willing to sell at different prices. Plot those points and you get an upward sloping supply curve. The higher the price, the more producers want to sell. And just like with demand, individual suppliers combine to form the market supply. Just like with demand, individual supply curves add up to create the market supply curve. In the source material, we see Pablo's supply curve for catnip. At a price of $4, Pablo supplies a certain number of ounces. But the market supply includes every catnip producer, not just Pablo. And here's a case study from the housing market. In a growing city like Austin, Texas, there are dozens of home builders, Lennar, D.R. Horton, Pulte, and many smaller local builders. Each builder has its own supply curve. At a market price of $300,000 for a typical home, Builder A might build 50 houses, Builder B builds 30, and Builder C builds 10. The market supply of new homes is the sum of all those individual quantities. When home prices rise, more builders enter the market and existing builders build more. The market supply curve slopes upward. When prices fall, some builders stop building and others scale back. The key insight is that the market supply curve captures the total production response of an entire industry, which is what actually matters for determining market prices. So we have buyers who want lower prices and sellers who want higher prices. How does the market resolve this conflict? Through equilibrium. Equilibrium is the point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. At that price, buyers are willing to buy exactly what sellers are willing to sell. No shortage, no surplus. The source material gives us a great example: the market for bacon shakes. At a price of $9, the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied at 400 units. That's the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. On a graph, it's where the demand curve and supply curve intersect, the equilibrium point. Here's a real-world case study. Think about the market for rental apartments in a mid-sized city. If the average rent is $1,200 a month, and at that price, landlords are willing to offer exactly as many apartments as renters want, the market is in equilibrium. But here's what makes equilibrium powerful. It's self-correcting. Price acts as a motivator. When prices are low, consumers buy more and sellers supply less. When prices are high, consumers buy less and sellers supply more. The price naturally gravitates toward the equilibrium point where both sides are satisfied. This balancing act is the core mechanism of any free market. What happens when the market isn't at equilibrium? Two things can go wrong: a surplus or a shortage. A surplus happens when supply exceeds demand. Imagine a farmer who grows too many watermelons and can't sell them all at the current price. The farmer has to lower the price to clear the inventory. As the price drops, more customers step in to buy, and some farmers decide to grow fewer watermelons next season. The price keeps falling until equilibrium is reached. A shortage is the opposite. Demand exceeds supply. This is where things get interesting. Let's talk about one of the most vivid case studies in recent history, the toilet paper shortage of 2020. When the pandemic hit, panic buying caused demand for toilet paper to surge dramatically. But toilet paper supply couldn't adjust overnight. Paper mills run 24/7 and can't just double production. The result was empty shelves everywhere. In economic terms, at the existing price, quantity demanded far exceeded quantity supplied. That's a textbook shortage. In a free market, the price would rise to ration the limited supply, but many retailers chose to keep prices stable and instead imposed purchase limits. Eventually, as panic buying subsided and supply chains adjusted, the market returned to equilibrium. The law of supply and demand says that prices naturally adjust until equilibrium is restored. Surplus pushes prices down. Shortage pushes prices up. Equilibrium is the resting point. So far, we've talked about movements along the demand and supply curves. When price changes, quantity changes. But sometimes the entire curve shifts. That's when something other than price changes the fundamental relationship. The source material gives us a 3-step method for analyzing these shifts. Step 1, identify whether the demand curve, the supply curve, or both have shifted. Step 2, determine the direction, left or right. Step 3, trace how the new curves change the equilibrium point. Let's look at a powerful case study, how the COVID-19 pandemic shifted multiple markets at once. First, demand for streaming services like Netflix shifted dramatically to the right. People were stuck at home and they wanted entertainment. Netflix added over 15 million subscribers in the first quarter of 2020 alone. Higher demand at every price point. That's a rightward shift of the demand curve, which raised both the equilibrium price and quantity. At the same time, demand for airline travel shifted sharply to the left. Fewer people were flying, so at any given ticket price, the quantity demanded was much lower. Airlines slashed prices and still flew near empty planes. That's a leftward demand shift, lowering both equilibrium price and quantity. And on the supply side, mask manufacturers shifted their supply curves to the right, as factories around the world retooled to produce personal protective equipment. At any given price, more masks were available. That's a rightward supply shift, which lowers equilibrium price and raises equilibrium quantity. The 3-step method helps you make sense of all these changes systematically. Let's summarize the effects of curve shifts side by side, because this is the part that really matters for exams and real-world analysis. When demand shifts to the right, meaning more people want the good at every price, both equilibrium price and quantity rise. Think about what happened to the price of used cars in 2021. A microchip shortage limited new car production, so demand for used cars surged to the right. Prices shot up. When demand shifts to the left, both price and quantity fall. The collapse in business travel during the pandemic is a perfect example. Hotels in downtown business districts had to slash room rates. Supply shifts work differently. When supply shifts to the right, more is available at every price. Equilibrium price falls, but quantity rises. Think about what happened to the price of flat-screen TVs over the past 15 years. Manufacturing improvements shifted supply steadily to the right, and prices plummeted while sales soared. When supply shifts to the left, price rises but quantity falls. The OPEC oil embargo of 1973 is the classic example. Oil supply shifted left, prices quadrupled, and gas stations ran out of fuel. Here's the key pattern to remember. Demand shifts move price and quantity in the same direction. Supply shifts move them in opposite directions. Get that straight, and you can analyze almost any market change. Let's go deeper into something I hinted at with the Starbucks example. Price elasticity of demand. Elasticity measures how responsive quantity demanded is to a change in price. If a small price increase causes a big drop in quantity demanded, demand is elastic. If quantity barely budges, demand is inelastic. Think about the difference between insulin and concert tickets. Insulin is a life-saving medication with no close substitutes. If the price doubles, patients still need the same amount. Demand is highly inelastic. But concert tickets? If Ticketmaster doubles the price, plenty of fans will decide to stay home. That's elastic demand. What determines elasticity? 3 main factors. First, the availability of substitutes. More substitutes means more elastic demand. Second, whether the good is a necessity or a luxury. Necessities tend to be inelastic. Third, the time horizon. Demand is usually more elastic in the long run because people had time to adjust their behavior. When gas prices spike, you still need to drive to work in the short term. But over a few years, you might buy a more fuel-efficient car or move closer to your job. That's elasticity changing over time. Understanding elasticity helps businesses set prices and helps governments predict the effects of taxes. So far, we've talked about free markets where prices adjust naturally. But sometimes governments step in and set prices artificially. These are called price controls, and they come in 2 varieties: price ceilings and price floors. A price ceiling is a maximum price. The law says you can't charge more than this amount. The classic example is rent control in cities like New York and San Francisco. The goal is to keep housing affordable. But here's what happens. When the ceiling is set below the equilibrium price, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. More people want apartments at the low price, but landlords have less incentive to build or maintain them. The result is a housing shortage, exactly what we see in rent-controlled cities, where waiting lists are years long and apartments are passed down through families. A price floor is the opposite, a minimum price. The most famous example is the minimum wage. When the floor is set above the equilibrium wage, the quantity of labor supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. More people want to work at the higher wage, but employers hire fewer workers. That's a labor surplus, unemployment. A price controls create persistent shortages or surpluses because they prevent the market from reaching equilibrium. Well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences when they ignore the basic logic of supply and demand. Let's put everything together with a comprehensive worked example. Imagine the market for electric vehicles. In 2023, the equilibrium price for a typical EV is $45,000, and manufacturers sell 2 million units per year. Now, 2 things happen simultaneously. First, the government introduces a new tax credit that gives buyers $7,500 off the purchase price. This makes EVs more attractive at every price point. The demand curve shifts to the right. More people want EVs. Second, battery technology improves dramatically, and a new gigafactory comes online. Manufacturers can now produce EVs more cheaply. At every price, they're willing to supply more. The supply curve shifts to the right. So both curves shift right. What happens to equilibrium? Quantity definitely rises. Both shifts push quantity up. But price is ambiguous. The demand shift pushes price up, while the supply shift pushes price down. The net effect depends on which shift is larger. If the supply improvement is bigger than the demand boost, prices fall even as sales surge. That's exactly what we've seen in the EV market over the past few years. Prices have been gradually falling while sales have skyrocketed. This example shows why the 3-step method is so powerful. By identifying each shift, determining its direction, and tracing the effects, you can make sense of complex real-world markets. even when multiple forces are acting at once. Let's pull everything together. The supply and demand model is one of the most powerful tools in economics because it explains so much with so little. First, the law of demand tells us that higher prices mean lower quantity demanded, and the law of supply tells us that higher prices mean higher quantity supplied. These two forces meet at equilibrium, the price where the market clears. Second, when the market is out of balance, prices adjust. Surpluses push prices down, shortages push prices up, and the market naturally gravitates back toward equilibrium. Third, when external events shift entire curves, you can predict the outcome using a simple framework. Identify which curve shifted, determine the direction, and trace the new equilibrium. Demand shifts move price and quantity together. Supply shifts move them in opposite directions. Whether you're analyzing the housing market, the price of gasoline, or the effects of a global pandemic, this framework gives you the tools to understand what's happening and why. That's the power of microeconomics. Thanks for watching. You now have a solid foundation in supply and demand fundamentals, from scarcity and opportunity cost, through the laws of supply and demand, to equilibrium, shortages, surpluses, and curve shifts. The next time you see a news story about rising rents or gas prices, you'll know exactly what economic forces are at work.